The cerebellum is the largest part of the hindbrain and second largest part of the brain, weighing about 150 grams. It maintains the tone, posture, and equilibrium of the body. Cerebellum controls the same side of the body, directly or indirectly. It does not initiate the movements, but it contributes to the coordination, precision, and accurate timing. The gray matter is highly folded to accommodate millions of neurons in a small area, and the arrangement is called arbor vitae, or the vital tree of life. The structure is uniform throughout, that is, homotypical. This diagram shows the arbor vitae. Here you can see the gray matter is folded, forming the folia. This is the white matter going inside the folia, and this arrangement is known as arbor vitae. The cerebellum is situated in the posterior cranial fossa behind the pons and medulla. It is an infratemporal structure that coordinates voluntary movements. Here in this diagram, you can see the cerebellum here having two lobes, right and left, connected by the vermis. Each cerebral hemisphere has got a superior surface and an inferior surface. It is anteriorly related to the fourth ventricle, to the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the relations are anteriorly fourth ventricle, pons, and medulla; posteriorly the squamous occipital bone; and superiorly the tentorium cerebellum. The cerebellum consists of two cerebral hemispheres united to each other through median vermis. It has two surfaces, superior and inferior. The superior surface is highly convex. The two hemispheres are continuous with each other on this surface. The inferior surface shows a small median notch called vallicula, which represents the right and left convex hemispheres. The anterior aspect is marked by a wide deep notch in which pons and medulla are lodged. Posteriorly, there is a narrow deep notch in which the falx cerebri lies. Each hemisphere is divided into three lobes by fissura prima and posterolateral fissure. The fissura prima on superior surface separates the anterior lobe from middle or the posterior lobe. The posterolateral fissure on inferior surface separates the middle lobe from the flocculonodular lobe. In this diagram, the superior and the inferior surfaces are shown in the same plane. The two lobes, the right and the left lobe, connected by the vermis. Here it is the primary fissure, the fissura prima, separating the anterior lobe from the middle or the posterior lobe. Yeah. This is the flocculonodular lobule separated from the posterior lobe by the posterolateral fissure. The posterior lobe is divided into two surfaces by the horizontal fissure. Here, the upper surface is the superior posterior lobe, and this is the inferior posterior lobe. The cerebellum is divided into numerous small parts by fissures that cut the vermis and both lobes. The horizontal fissure separates the superior surface from the inferior surface. The primary fissure, or the fissura prima, separates the anterior lobe from the middle lobe on the superior surface. The posterolateral fissure separates the middle lobe from flacculonodular lobe on the inferior surface. Morphological subdivisions. There are three morphological subdivisions as per the development. The archicerebellum is phylogenetically the oldest part of the cerebellum to appear in evolution in aquatic vertebrates. It includes the flacculonodular lobe and lingula. It is chiefly vestibular in connections. It controls the axial musculature and bilateral movements used for locomotion and maintenance of equilibrium. The periocerebellum is the next part of the cerebellum to appear in the terrestrial vertebrates with appearance of limbs. It consists of anterior lobe except the lingula and the pyramid and uvula of the inferior vermis. Its connections are chiefly spinocerebellar. It controls tone, posture, and crude movements of the limbs. Neocerebellum. It is the largest part and newest in of the cerebellum to develop. It is made up of posterior or the inferior lobe, posterior or the middle lobe of the cerebellum except the pyramid and uvula of the inferior vermis. It is primarily concerned with the regulation of fine movements of the body. Functional subdivisions. The anterior and the posterior lobes are organized into three longitudinal zones: lateral, intermediate, and vermis. The lateral zone is connected with the association areas of the brain and is involved in planning, programming, and coordination of the muscular activities of entire body. The intermediate zone is concerned with the control of muscles of distal parts of the limbs like hand and feet via rubrospinal tract. Median zone or the vermis is concerned with the control of the muscles of the trunk, neck, shoulder, and hip through the vestibulospinal and reticulospinal tracts. The flacculonodular lobe, this is the extra lobe. This lobe functions with the vestibular system in controlling the equilibrium. Connections. The fibers entering or leaving the cerebellum are grouped to form three peduncles which connect the cerebellum to midbrain, pons, and medulla. The superior cerebral peduncle connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. It is chiefly efferent in nature. Its afferent tracts are anterior spinocerebellar and tectocerebellar. Its efferent tracts are globo- globorubric, dentato-thalamic, dentato-olivary, and fastigioreticular. The middle cerebral peduncle connects the cerebellum to pons. It is a part of the corticospinocerebral pathway. It is chiefly afferent in nature. This diagram shows the cerebellum connected to the brainstem through the superior cerebral peduncle, connecting it with the midbrain, the middle cerebral peduncle connecting with the pons, and inferior cerebral peduncle connecting with the medulla oblongata. The inferior cerebral peduncle, as you can see, it carries the proprioceptive information from spinocerebral tract. It is the mossy fibers and climbing fibers from the inferior olive of the medulla oblongata. Then middle cerebral peduncle here you can see it carries the pontocerebral fibers, which is a part of the cortico-pontocerebral pathway. Fibers, corticopontine fibers coming from the cerebral cortex, terminating on the pontine nuclei, and the efferents pass to the cerebellum through the middle cerebral peduncle. Here you can see the superior cerebral peduncle connecting the cerebellum with the midbrain, carrying the uh, fibers from the dentate nucleus and from the fastigious and globosous nuclei, from the fastigious going to the vestibular nuclei, and so the superior cerebral peduncle fibers are going to the thalamus and to the red nucleus. The inferior cerebral peduncle, it is chiefly afferent in nature. It receives afferents from posterior spinocerebellar tract, geniocerebellar tract, that is the posterior external arcuate fibers, alveocerebellar, polyalveocerebellar, reticulocerebellar, vestibulocerebellar, anti-external arcuate fibers, striae medullaris, and trigeminocerebellar tracts. It sends efferents through the fastigiovestibular tract, cerebello-alveolar tract, and fastigioreticular tracts. Here in this diagram, you can see the fibers going passing through the inferior cerebral peduncle. You can see the inferior cerebral peduncle receives fibers from the spinal cord to the posterior spinocerebellar fibers, from the medulla oblongata, that is the from the accessory cuneate nucleus, forming the posterior external arcuate fibers are the geniocerebellar tracts. Then from the pons, it carries the anti-external arcuate fibers from the arcuate nuclei, from the inferior olivary nucleus, there is the olivocerebellar, then the parolivocerebellar tract here. Then here from the thalamus, coming from the ventral nucleus, you can see the thalamocerebellar tracts. The gray matter of this cerebellum, it consists of cerebral cortex and cerebral nuclei. There are four pairs of nuclei. The nucleus dentatus is the neocerebellar, nucleus globosus, nucleus emboliformis is the paleocerebellar, and nucleus fastigii is the archicerebellar in nature. This is the horizontal section of the cerebellum showing the gray matter which is forming the cerebral cortex here. Then here is the white matter in the central part, that is the medullary center, which shows the embedded gray matter in the form of nucleus dentatus, nucleus emboliformis, nucleus globosus, and nucleus fastigii. Blood supply. The cerebellum is supplied by two superior cerebral arteries. These are the branches of basilar artery. There are two anterior inferior cerebral arteries. There are also branches of the basilar artery. Then there are two posterior inferior cerebral arteries, which are the branches of vertebral arteries. Then veins from the cerebellum drain into the neighboring venous sinuses. Functions of the cerebellum. The cerebellum controls the same side of the body, that is, the control is ipsilateral. It coordinates voluntary movements so that they are smooth, balanced, and accurate. The cerebellum controls tone, posture, and equilibrium. This is chiefly done by archicerebellum and periocerebellum. The cerebellum controls movements of the eyeball. It controls and coordinates these movements of the eyeball by affecting the agonists, antagonist, and synergistic muscles. It also helps in learning of the spatial motor skills. It plays a role in cognition. The flocculonodal lobe is connected to the vestibular nuclei. It is involved in maintenance of muscle tone and posture. Spinocerebellum, vermis, and intermediate regions receives afferent from motor cortex via corticopontocerebellar fibers. All sensory information of the muscles, joints, cutaneous, auditory, and visual parts are relayed here. Spinocerebellar tracts carry information on the same site. The vermis controls axial muscles, thus maintains posture. Paramedian areas are involved in control of distal group of muscles to bring smooth coordinated activity. The cerebellum acts as a comparator. It receives information from cerebrum and spinal cord. It correlates and modifies ongoing movements through thalamocortical projections, reticulospinal and rubriospinal tracts. The neocerebellum is involved in fine-tuning of motor performance for precise movements. It helps in planning and production of skilled movements along with the cerebellum. It has been seen by functional magnetic resonance imaging, that is fMRI, that if fingers of the right hand are moved repetitively, the activity is seen in precentral gyrus of the left cerebral cortex and in anterior quadrangular lobe of the right cerebellar hemisphere. Then clinical anatomy. There are two very important conditions, that is a cerebral dysfunction. The lesions of the vermis leads to the truncal ataxia as connections of the vermis to vestibular nuclei are involved. The nystagmus is due to loss of labyrinthine connections of the vermis to labyrinth. Vermis is also related to the emotions. The anterior lobe lesions causes gait ataxia. There is incoordination of lower limbs, resulting in staggering gait and inability to walk in a straight line. It is also seen in alcoholics. Neocerebral lesions. The neocerebral lesions causes incoordination of voluntary movements of the upper limb. It results in intention tremors, action tremors, and overshoot movements. Speech is also defective. Phonation is defective due to loss of smooth functioning of expiratory muscles. Articulation is defective as there is a loss of coordination between muscles of lips, tongues, and palate. Then the second clinical condition important is cerebellum cognitive affective syndrome. It occurs due to the thrombosis of one of the six arteries supplying cerebellum. These patients present with inattention, grammatical errors in speech, and patchy memory loss. Involvement of the vermis results in dulling of the emotional response. It is characterized by muscular hypotonia, intention tremors, that is, tremors only during movements. It can be tested by finger nose test and heel knee test. Then adietokinesia, which is an inability to perform rapid and regular alternating movements. For example, pronation and supination. Then nystagmus is to and fro oscillatory movements of eyeballs while looking to either side. Then scanning speech is a jerky and explosive speech. Then ataxia or unsteady gait. So this is all about the gross anatomy of the connections of the cerebrum, its blood supply, and the various clinical conditions associated with the cerebrum.